Welcome to Tigrai Media House. My name is Maliti Brahana. It has been 22 months since the war on Tigray began, and we still have a complete siege on the people of Tigray. No access to fuel, no access to food, no access to water, no access to banking. The siege continues, and people are dying daily because of inaction. These are preventable deaths in Tigray. Just this week, we saw a return to conventional warfare after the Ethiopian government began shelling again just a few days ago. Shortly after, a kindergarten was bombed in Mekelle, which was reportedly 14 people have died. The youngest victim is 3 years old. Today's guest is Rashid Abdi. He is an analyst and expert on the Horn of Africa. His analysis is poignant and timely, and even prior to the war beginning, Rashid was calling out that this was coming. I recall your messages, Rashid. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're honored to have you on the show. I recall your messages in October about troops coming from Eritrea coming south, and also the Ethiopian troops amassing on the southern border of Tigray. You were sending smoke signals up when no one was listening. So we're really honored to have you today to talk about what's next and what to expect, and just to analyze what has been happening in the Horn of Africa in general. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Millet, and also my thanks to Tigrai Media House for giving me this opportunity to, I think, share my thoughts about what is happening in Tigray.
Yes.
As you suggested, I think the resumption of conflict is definitely disappointing. It's a huge, I think, setback for at least the tentative efforts that were being made by not just the Tigrayans, but also Ethiopians as well, and also members of the international community to try to see at least a way out of the conflict in Ethiopia. But I think, this conflict has not caught anybody by surprise. It has been, you don't launch a war in days. You prepare for war. The preparations are very visible. You mass troops on borders. You move troops, personnel. So it is a huge logistical affair and cannot be hidden. And so the war was coming and everybody knew it. But apparently, I think the international community has this tendency of always being caught in a surprise. There was also a lot of positive thinking and positive language, which I think is part of the problem. People knew the crisis, and instead of, I think, looking for ways of at least realistically and robustly dealing with some of the challenges we faced in the negotiations, they decided to put a positive spin to everything that was happening. Now,
Yes.
the siege is very crucial to understanding the renewed conflict. The Tigrayan people and government had a very narrow window in which they had to show progress for their restraint, in which they had to show their people some kind of positive outcome about this process of engagement. The Tigrayans withdrew from many parts of Ethiopia, withdrew to their border in the hope and in the promise that the siege will be lifted. And the siege continued. And even worse, the siege became a matter for negotiations, which I think is astonishing because the siege itself was very criminal. It had no basis in Ethiopian law, but also it has no basis in international law. It is it is a form of collective punishment under the UN conventions. And so when Abiy government said that negotiations, the siege had to be negotiated and then incrementally, eased, that sounded astonishing, I think, to the Tigrayan side. For the Tigrayans, it was just automatic. They are citizens of Ethiopia. They are entitled to their banking rights. They are entitled to basic amenities. So why has the siege become a matter for negotiations? And I think
Yes.
that is when it became clear that
the capital, where they have more resources. This is not even considering what is happening to the people in the countryside. So the truce was not really a truce. And people point to the aid trucks that were coming in, and our photo ops of these aid trucks, and lines and lines of trucks going into Tigray. But the truth is, it was grossly inadequate. It was not reaching. I describe it as if you take a water gun to a forest fire. It's just not going to meet the need there. Let me back up for a minute. I want to talk about what happened recently with the bombing at the kindergarten. What do you make of a government, bombing its own people repeatedly, by the way? This one just happens to hit a kindergarten, but bombing civilian targets, and then hitting a kindergarten. It's such barbarity. And the truth is, it's not the first time that it has happened, even in this war, in terms of hitting civilians and targeting IDP camps and hospitals. But even in 1998, the Eritreans bombed a school and 48 people were killed in that bombing. And so here we are again. What do you make of such barbarity of bombing a kindergarten?
First of all, my commiserations with the families of the children who have been killed, and also the other victims of the bombing in Mekelle. It is unfortunate, but as you suggested, this is a recurrent. There is a pattern, and it is a classic technique of warfare. If you want to basically make sure that there is some notice, and also you put pressure on your adversaries. I think conducting this kind of raids is quite routine. It's been done in conflict and warfare for decades, if not for millennia. So it's not new. Unfortunately, this is a repeated pattern, and the impunity of it is also what I think is astonishing. Abiy has gotten away with many, I think, similar atrocities. Unfortunately, there isn't any system of accountability. There was a UN, I think, team that went into Ethiopia recently to try to, I think, look at war crimes, but it hasn't, I think, received the kind of support that is required. One hopes that eventually there will be some form of, I think, justice for the victims of these kind of atrocities. It is inexcusable for an army the size of Ethiopia to be conducting, I think, strikes on kindergartens and playgrounds of children, whatever the excuse. Harming and putting civilians in harm's way is inexcusable. Now, the Ethiopian Air Force claims to have drones, and drones will probably give you greater accuracy, not entirely 100%. But when you also deploy air power in a conflict like Ethiopia, you are bound to cause civilian deaths for a variety of reasons. Conducting air raids in the midst of a busy city is always very, very, I think, dangerous. And after the bombing in Mekelle, I hope Addis will be dissuaded against deploying this kind of lethal power in cities. But as you said, this is not going to stop. Unfortunately, it's an outcome of conflict, and also increasing viciousness of, I think, the superior force, which has air forces, basically feels that if it can maintain this kind of public pressure on the Tigrayan government, there will be a sort of a groundswell of opposition to the government. So this is to orchestrate fear and to cause, I think, resentment against the current government, which is in Mekelle. These are all techniques which have been used in warfare before.
Yes. And frankly, and in short, it's terrorism is what it is. Terrorism on the people of Tigray. I think it's interesting too, you brought up drones. This particular strike was not a drone strike, but there were drone strikes in the past that should be more accurate. But if that's the case, then that means the Ethiopian government intentionally hit hospitals with those drones and intentionally hit the IDP camp, because that's what was hit with the previous drone. So I think that's a very interesting conversation. The other thing I want to say is more evidence that this is terrorism is that the Ethiopian government, after hitting the kindergarten, put out a message on Twitter and in English warning Tigrayans to avoid potential targets, potential military zones or whatever, where they would be attacking. But first of all, who would think a kindergarten is a potential military zone, for one? But for two, how would Tigrayans even see the message? They have no access to internet. They have no phones. Yeah. They don't have access. And then it's in English. And so how would they even be able to read the message and heed the warning? And then it's on Twitter. So the absurdity of thinking a mountain people, predominantly farmers, are on Twitter looking for warnings from their government. I mean, it's such a game. Why do you think Abiy continues to get a pass? This has been a frustrating conversation and debate that we've had in different circles. The world refuses to hold him accountable, which means he holds some value to these other powers. What is your analysis on why we can't seem to get anyone to hold him accountable?
Yes, Millet, you are right. Abiy may not be a strategic thinker, but he definitely is a good tactician. And increasingly, we are in a world where people do not want to engage in conflict situations. So there is a lot of conflict fatigue. And the tendency, I think, in many of the powerful states, especially, is to invest as little as possible, to be as less disruptive as possible. To work with what is there, not to look for the longer, strategic value, but also to go for very short-term fixes. And I think this is where Abiy becomes extremely useful. Abiy himself doesn't have a bigger, longer-term, objective. He's desperately trying to salvage his government, his, coalition. And he hopes that somehow he can find a military solution, which again defies or flies in the face of what is there on the ground today. But the reality is that we live in a world in which Ethiopia is regarded as a big, major anchor state in the Horn. It cannot afford to collapse, and if Abiy can somehow be nudged towards some kind of a political settlement, that will be good. So I think the thinking in the international community, especially the Western governments, is that Abiy can be somehow, steered or nudged towards some kind of a political settlement. And I think this has been a false hope, which has been there all along. And Abiy has exploited that very cleverly. And if you look at the way he has played this game, is that first of all, he has not said that he's not ready for peace. He's engaged. He sent emissaries to Djibouti, to Seychelles, to engage the TPLF. He gives the semblance of movement. He's also the siege. He tells the international community that I'm ready for peace. I'm willing to do anything you want. He whispers into the ear of Faki and tells him, look, make the old man Obasanjo, play his games, So there is this fight over who actually should mediate. So he puts every screw in the works to basically stall the process. And you can see this is a leader who is playing for time, is disinterested in peace. And I think the time has really come for the international community to realize what kind of a leader Abiy is. Abiy is not the kind of leader who will deliver peace. And I think the Tigrayans have realized also that. Initially, there was at least some pressure on the TPLF to really engage him. thinking that they could get somewhere with him. But unfortunately, he is what he is, somebody who cannot deliver. And I think you also have to understand the mechanics of his alliance. His alliance is essentially based now, essentially primarily, he derives his political legitimacy and credibility from the Amhara. And this is a major constituency in Ethiopia. He's lost Oromo support. He's lost other ethnic support. So he's entirely reliant on the Amhara. And the Amhara, for a variety of reasons, have a historical animosity with the Tigrayan people. And, this is also a historical sort of score settling which is going on with the extreme Amhara nationalists now using Abiy to achieve what they have always wanted, which is control of the agriculturally, lucrative and huge potential in Western Tigray, Wolkayit and other, districts. And so the other, I think, alliance, which is important to remember, is the Eritrean one. Eritrea does not want peace. They want to destroy Tigray. They want to destroy the TPLF. They will never rest until that happens. And all machinations that has been going on is to essentially achieve that. Is Eritrea, a possible party to a future peace talks? I don't think so. So this is a zero-sum game, unfortunately, in which one party has to prevail. And I think if the Tigrayans prevail over Abiy, their sights will definitely be on Asmara and on Eritrea, because that, I think, is where the problem lies. It is Asmara and Afewerki who instigated this conflict and who also keeps the momentum of this conflict going. So all these vested interests have a very powerful reason why peace is dangerous, because peace will maintain at least a stable, or rather will maintain the TPLF in power in Tigray.
So let's talk about Eritrea, since you brought them up, because I think that they often get a pass in all of these conversations, or they're sort of a secondary point, when really a lot of this, as you said, originated because of Isaias Afewerki and his long-term grudge with the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Isaias and Eritrea is a pariah in the Horn of Africa. He fights with everyone. He's built an economy that depends on war to survive. I mean, their biggest export is probably people. There are more people outside of Eritrea than live in the country of Eritrea. There was a great documentary called Escaping Eritrea that came out not too long ago, giving the terrible conditions of the people in the country. Isaias Afewerki needs war in order to remain in power. He needs a boogeyman. He needs the people to feel like someone is coming for them. And so therefore they must fight and they must sacrifice their children. What is your opinion about why he has so much influence and he's able to con, another country that's far greater? I mean, you could even describe them as two extremes. Ethiopia was a success story in Africa, and Eritrea was the failure story. And yet Eritrea has been able to sort of overtake the politics of Ethiopia. Why do you think he has so much influence? And do you think we can have peace so long as Isaias Afewerki is still keeps the power position that he has?
I think let me start with the last question, because it is the easiest. There's no hope or prospect for peace in the Horn while Isaias Afewerki is in power, unless there is regime change in Asmara and in Eritrea. It is very unlikely that Ethiopia will be stable, or even other regions will be stable. Right now, there is also a crisis in Eastern Sudan in which the Eritreans are involved. Now, Eritrea is a small country, but it has a very powerful state. It has a very strong party machinery, which also has good mechanisms for infiltrating, enemy countries and institutions. In many ways, Eritrea is today the deep state in Ethiopia. They control the security services, the army command, and so on. And that is really astonishing, considering that this is a tiny country. But we are where we are, which is Ethiopia is now a much more weaker country. It is deeply fragmented, entirely reliant on the goodwill of Eritrea to basically keep off, Tigray, contain Tigray. So the containment of Tigray is what brings Afewerki and Abiy together. Now, there have been reports in recent months that Abiy and Afewerki do not necessarily see eye to eye, and they have divergent interests, and at some point they will part ways. That is quite a possibility, but you can see what Eritrea is doing. Eritrea is actually planning for such an eventuality. We have seen how they have built these strategic alliances with Afar armed groups. They have built also strategic partnerships with the Amhara state. They train their security forces, they train their militia, including even the Fano. So, in other words, what you are seeing is Eritrea moving swiftly to build a wall of military formations around Abiy, to tell him that if you don't play ball with us, we basically can use these other forces to either crush you or contain you. So this is also one of the dynamics, I think, which is keeping this conflict going. Abiy, in many ways, of course, he does have agency. He's the prime minister of Ethiopia. Whatever you want to say about the elections, he can steer that country in a different direction. But in many ways, he is trapped. If he tries to navigate and make peace, I think most likely he will either be assassinated or he will be removed in a coup. Because the Amhara don't like him, and increasingly they're suspicious of him, and they dominate the security forces and the army, and they could move swiftly against him. In many ways, Abiy has put himself in a situation where from now henceforth he can only be a yes man. He can only say yes and cannot say no. If he says no, he'll be ousted.
Wow, that is really powerful. Eritrea is the deep state, is how you described it, and Abiy is trapped. He's trapped. Wow, that's really powerful. Do you feel like there's a proxy war of sorts also playing out? We hear this as well? So yes, there's civil war. Yes, there's genocide. But is there also a proxy war? Is the United States being more reserved because they're afraid of losing even more influence in the Horn of Africa to China, which, by the way, in my opinion, they're too late. The Chinese have been there for so long. But what is your opinion? Mm-hmm. Do you feel like there is a proxy war, and that's also, part and parcel to why we can't get help, and meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Africans are dying? What is your take on that?
I think the short answer is that the U.S. doesn't have an Ethiopia strategy. It has, I think, desperately tried to build one, and hasn't so far come up with one. It has always been reacting to events, deploying their firepower, diplomatic firepower, sending special envoys. But beyond that, I don't think there is any clarity. We have had 3 envoys so far, Horn envoys from the US. All of those special envoys, all of them banned by the Ethiopia crisis. This high turnover should definitely be a signal that there is a lot of also internal, I think, lack of coherence and clarity on where Washington should go. And you can see that in the kind of press statements which comes from Washington, but also comes from the embassy in Addis. We assume a lot of clarity on the part of the US. I don't think they have that clear game plan. What they have, of course, is leverage. The United States still has leverage in Ethiopia, undoubtedly. There's a huge Ethiopian diaspora which lives in the United States. Historically, especially during the EPRDF times, Washington saw Ethiopia as an anchor state, indispensable for the peace and security of the Horn of Africa. And that still, I think, exercises a lot of weight on how Washington perceives Addis. This also explains the deference toward Abiy. Despite reservations about Abiy and all the disquiet and sense of unease with his politics, there is still, I think, a strong impetus within Washington to manage things quietly and not to basically put pressure on Ethiopia. After I think, removing AGOA from Ethiopia, which caused actually Abiy to reverse his positions very quickly, we haven't seen any kind of strong, coercive diplomacy deployed. I suspect that in the coming few weeks, we will see increased calls for more coercive diplomacy in Ethiopia to push Abiy towards some form of a political settlement, especially from Washington. I think you also hinted there of the geopolitical great game which is going on in the Horn. The Ethiopia is a massive, massive market. If you are a foreign power and you are looking for a foreign market, Ethiopia is massive. And it is also geostrategically located just on the edge of Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So it is very strategically located as well. So that explains why there is this competition between the great powers. The Chinese put money in infrastructure in Ethiopia, built the Djibouti-Addis Railway. There's a lot of commercial stake. Also, the biggest creditor in Ethiopia is the Chinese. So China has a deep stake, a stake in Ethiopia. Increasingly, we are also living in a world where we are seeing three powers now fighting for supremacy and dominance: the United States, China, and Russia. Russia's foreign minister visited Addis. That is also a bad signal for the Ethiopians, for the Washington to basically, up its game in Ethiopia, because I think Abiy is cleverly sending signals to say that, look, if you put pressure on us, we can actually, pivot towards Moscow. So that, I think, is a strategy also. But the great game, as you rightly pointed out, is also feeding this instability and chaos in Ethiopia.
That's powerful. And as you know, Russia is building a base in Eritrea right now. And just last week, the Chinese announced that they were waiving the debt of, I believe, 17 African countries. So there's a whole...
Ethiopia included, yes.
Ethiopia included. So if the US is trying to keep their power, I think they're far behind. I don't think they have an accurate assessment of where they are compared to these other countries they're competing with. So that's powerful. A big thing that we've heard is African solutions to African problems. But frankly, Africans have been either delayed or afraid to speak up because of the massive attacks that come from these trolls. And the AU has been just willfully negligent and frankly is not taken seriously anymore in these negotiations. But I do believe there is power in the people. And so what is your take on why Africans have been so afraid to speak up? I mean, you cannot have African solutions to African problems if Africans have gone mute. What is your take on Africa?
I think one of the most striking features of the conflict in Ethiopia is how much Ethiopia has historically been sheltered from any scrutiny. First of all, it is the headquarters of the African Union. Ethiopia, historically, especially during the imperial years, and the former monarch, had very strong Pan-African credentials. The Ethiopian culture and traditions travel even to the Caribbean. You have the Jamaican, Rastafarian movement actually looked to Ethiopia for some kind of a spiritual guidance. So, there's this huge credentials, soft power image which Ethiopia enjoyed. Now, people in Africa cannot believe that Ethiopia, is in crisis or is in conflict, or rather Ethiopia is cannibalizing itself. Its own ethnic communities are eating each other. They can't believe that. They think this is a conspiracy by the West and it's a colonial project. So this is why also Abiy has invested in actually this kind of narrative. This is what Hermela and her TV are doing. The No More movement is to build this, inflate this Pan-African image, to say that Ethiopia is a great Pan-African power. And the crisis today is actually being caused by foreigners. So this narrative is very powerful, very potent. And as long as you have also the AU based in Addis, that also restrains the ability of the AU to really play a robust, role in really managing the conflict in its own host country. And this is why, it became extremely difficult for Faki to really take an independent path from Abiy. And Abiy quickly went to control of Faki and the AU to basically manage the war. And this, because AU also has influence over the UN, over the EU, over other institutions, multilateral institutions elsewhere, what AU says goes. So that also explains why Abiy has gotten away with all these weeks and months of crisis. Still, people see him as a peacemaker, and that I think is why we need at least independent African voices to be coming out and saying, "Wait a minute." This is an ordinary African country. Ethiopia has historically invested in conflict management, conflict resolution in other countries. We actually are doing Ethiopia a favor by actually now investing in conflict resolution inside Ethiopia. We are returning the favor which Ethiopians have shown us in the past. So when Ethiopia say no, when the No More movement says do not interfere, actually, I would argue that this is the time for Africans to interfere in Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is in crisis, it is unraveling, and the prospect of actually Ethiopia becoming ungovernable, where you will actually have all sort of criminal syndicates and also terrorist groups growing, is actually very real. For the first time in decades, Ethiopia's border was breached, and you had Al-Shabaab attack and penetrate inside Ethiopia. That is a wake-up call that Ethiopia is declining, it's unable to defend its own external borders, and is now more vulnerable to terrorism. And I think once people realize that Ethiopia is now a vulnerable state, and because of its power, if it collapses, it sends shockwaves across the Horn, people will begin to look and view the crisis in Ethiopia differently. And I think we'll begin to engage differently. But it is also up to the Tigrayans to be making that kind of, articulate that kind of message to the external, powers as well as, foreign powers. But I think that there's definitely a space for increased Tigrayan intervention and mediation and also diplomacy in Africa. We have excellent Tigrayan diplomats who served in the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry. They could be sent as emissaries to African capitals to tell people, look, what is happening in Tigray is essentially genocidal, and we need Africa to galvanize. When Africa says there is a problem and begins to toughen its language, the rest of the world will follow suit. But unfortunately, that has to be a process. But I think that it is something which can be done.
Wow, you said Ethiopia is cannibalizing itself, and it's hard for Africans to recognize that. That's a really poignant statement, especially because quite literally, Ethiopia, there are images coming out of burning Tigrayans alive, and the people doing it making jokes about, should we eat him with bread or should we eat him with injera? And they're not probably literally going to eat them, but even the jokes and the imagery that was coming just recently, this is recent. So, I should have given a trigger warning before saying that for people watching. But you said something really important too about this image of Ethiopian exceptionalism. And it's one that is finally being sort of dismantled, and the truth about, what is Ethiopia, this nation of nations, and how have we been able to get along, and what is the real history behind all of this? Many people don't even realize slavery didn't get outlawed in Ethiopia until the 1940s. So, there's a lot there, I think, that is not told honestly. And now all of those stories are starting to come out and in very gruesome ways. What do you think about the African Union and the negotiating that's happening with President Obasanjo? Do you think he's compromised at this point? I mean, he brought the absurd idea that Eritrea should be part of the negotiations. Now, of course, Eritrea is a part of the problem, but the idea that they would be a part of the solution in terms of being peace brokers doesn't even pass the sniff test. What is your thought on President Obasanjo, and do we need someone new to lead that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Coincidentally, I think there was an editorial that came out from Addis standard, which I will recommend readers to look at. I think there's no doubt that the African Union mediation has been in crisis for a while, and Obasanjo has really compromised his position as a neutral mediator. He's lost that lost that currency. And as we probably know, in every conflict mediation and resolution, the important I think factor is, or rather there is a dictum which says a mediator cannot become a problem. If the mediator becomes a problem, then that mediation has failed. In the last 1 year, there has been a fight over the mediator himself. He's become the issue. And once you become the issue, I think the right thing and the honorable thing for him to have done is to step aside and say, I have lost the confidence of the Tigray